Happy August, and welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 23. We are going to start with a question from Roy from Oregon, who asks, what exactly is wrong with the argument that free will is an emergent property? It seems consistent with not being able to find it by dissecting individual components, neurons, decisions, etc. Can it not be that free will is the whole, which is greater than the sum of its parts?
Well, very well challenged on the part of Roy, in terms of, if you're going to say there's no such thing as free will, one of the things you've got to bat down is emergent complexity, along with the notion that free will could come from chaotic systems or it can come from quantum indeterminacy, which are two other domains. Emergence, totally cool phenomenon. You start with some stupidly simplistic little building block that only does a couple of things and it interacts with immediate neighbors, and you put a gazillion of them together, all with those rules, and out emerges something really complicated and adaptive and beautiful, and in particular, that has properties that can only be described up at this emergent level. Okay, what do I mean by that? You take one ant and you put it on a table and it makes no sense what it's doing. You put 10 ants, they're wandering around. You put 100, I don't know, they start following each other. You put 10,000 and they build an ant colony where they have, job specialization and castes, and they grow mushrooms and they make slaves out of aphids or milk them or something, and they have a whole communicate, and they're totally amazing, and each ant is no smarter than it was at the beginning, and something emerges, jargon in the field, with enough quantity you invent quality, more is different. And this whole notion of you get a property that emerges that can only be described at this emergent level. Perfect example of it is a single molecule of water cannot possess the property of feeling wet. Wetness is an emergent property of putting a whole bunch of water molecules together. Okay, so stuff unexpected pops out, and it turns out some of the same ways that ants optimize their rules for getting emergent adaptive complexity is exactly what your brain does when it's wiring up when you're a fetus, and explains why everybody has brains that are sort of similar, but none of them are identical. So all of this has prompted people to decide this is where you can be getting free will from. You start with simple building blocks, and as emphasized in the question, studying things just down on the reductive level of the individual building blocks is not going to tell you anything. Is at this big emergent level, out of that pops the phenomenon of wetness, or the phenomenon of us being able to be the captains of our ships. Okay, 3 reasons why you can't pull free will out of emergent complexity. First one is kind of flipping things upside down. All of the fights about free will are between philosophical compatibilists and incompatibilists, in that all of those, of both of those stripes, are determinists saying, yeah, it's a material universe and it's made of atoms and cells and all of that, and we're built of that stuff. And the compatibilists say, and a materialistic deterministic world like that nonetheless is compatible with free will, while incompatibilists like me and my cadres say, no, it is incompatible. And the whole argument there being, can you squeeze free will out of a deterministic system? So the first clever thing there is saying, these systems, these emergently complex systems, it is not formally possible to predict what you're going to get. They are unpredictable systems. And that's where the mistake is made in thinking that systems that are complexly unpredictable are thus undetermined. We don't have to have a compatibilist-incompatibilist argument because it's not a deterministic world and you could pull free will out that way. And this is sort of a classic mistake that's made. Undetermined is not the same as unpredictable in like a very fundamental way. second way that people pull free will out of emergence, which is deciding, okay, so you've got all these little building blocks that do simple, logical, local things of how they interact with the other building blocks. And out comes amazing stuff, which at that point can fly off and do whatever it wants, that it becomes free of the rules of its component parts, that it becomes unmoored by it and can suddenly have properties it couldn't otherwise, like free will, like being able to be free of your history. And this is a version philosophers talk about, like weak and strong emergence. Emergent systems that are free of their building blocks are termed strong emergent systems. And philosophers argue about whether they can actually exist. And the brain is not an example of one. You don't suddenly get emergent properties that are free of the fact that they're made of reductive stuff. Even if you can't predict stuff about the complexity from studying just the reductive stuff, because stuff emerges, nonetheless, it is still made up of the rules of these things. So that fails. The final trick that people use to try to pull free will out of emergence is to say, aha, once you get an emergent system up here, it has the capacity to have downward causality and change the component parts. It's not that you get free of the component parts, you can reach down and change them. And that's like saying, okay, once you get enough water molecules together, all of this wetness can cause water molecules so that suddenly, instead of having 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, you now have 2 oxygens and 1 hydrogen, and that's what makes the wetness. Or if you get 10,000 ants together or making a whole colony, not only that, but suddenly the ants can speak French, or suddenly neurons can levitate or something, and that fails. Insofar as no one can show that that happens, they're still working the same way, but it fails mostly on the conceptual level. The whole thing that makes emergence incredible and unbelievable, all of that is you got these stupid, simple little building blocks like an ant, like a water molecule, like a neuron, like a molecule, and enough of them and more is different, and all of that amazing stuff is happening amid them still being stupidly simplistic with the same little rules. It doesn't work that suddenly they get fancier and smarter, and suddenly you can emerge stuff like you can behave free of your history. So those are the 3 reasons why you really can't pull free will out of emergent complexity. Indeterminacy and unpredictability are not the same thing. Emergent systems cannot become free of their building blocks, and emergent systems can't reach down and make the building blocks smarter and do stuff that neurons normally don't do or ants don't do. So that's what I think.
Great. So next, Nishay from Turkey says, are religious people actually more honest and generous?
Well, Nishay, I'm particularly glad to get that question from somebody in Turkey, a country that has spent, I don't know, the last century trying to figure out what's the role of religiosity versus secularism in their society, and some pretty dramatic fluctuations, and what is not a mere academic question there. Okay. Everybody knows the answer to it, which is religious people are kinder, they're more honest, they're more trustworthy, they're more generous. And in fact, people in society after society have some really bad biases against atheists. And all sorts of polls, who do you have more negative feelings about? This racial group, this religious group, this ethnic group, whatever, and people who don't believe in God. And atheists are at the top of the list of people who are not trusted. You can't get voted into office if you're openly an atheist. There's parts of the country where juries are more likely to convict you, shown with mock jury studies, things like that. I saw one study where it was like a whole list of words, and which of these words do you associate with religious people and which with atheists? And among the words associated with atheist was necrobestiality. I didn't even know this could exist. Like, come on, like both of those combined into one. This seemed a little bit outrageous. There was this great study some years ago. There was a shoe company, a sneaker company, or running shoe company or other in Germany. And I don't know why they called their product what it did, but they were called atheist shoes, which I think meant something different in Germany. And there was a problem popping up in that people would buy them online. And a lot of people in the US would complain that they bought these shoes and they never arrived. And someone came up with an idea that they did a controlled experiment. Half of the shoes that they mailed off, they mailed in their atheist shoes box, and half of them in a brown paper package. And every one of the brown paper package ones would get delivered, and like a third of the ones saying the label, someone in the post office would be so outraged at the potential sort of moral turpitude that would happen if they delivered these shoes that they lost them in transit. No shoes were lost delivered to European customers. Okay, so atheists have a really bad rap there. And the general question that becomes, is it justified? Is it true, as commonly perceived, that religious people are more honest, more trustworthy, more generous, more pro-social, all of that? So in order to ask that, you got to immediately wrestle with a few things. First off, the self-selection bias. You don't randomly reach into your cage of lab rats and say, you're going to become deeply religious, you're going to be the atheist, and let's see how it all goes. This self-selection stuff that goes on. Next is, if you were ever stranded on a desert island for 10 years with an entire congregation of Quakers and then 10 years with a whole congregation of Southern Baptists, you're probably going to have some very different experiences. There's huge heterogeneity to religious groups. So saying religion is obviously very simplifying. In addition, saying atheists is very simplifying also. Safi, come on up. Come here. No, you're going the other way. Okay, so there's heterogeneity to atheism also. There's atheists where it defines them and they're strident, and there's atheists where it's apatheists. They there's no God, but it's not like I think about it. There's atheists where the only thing they want to communicate is a negative. There is no God, as opposed to atheists much more involved in humanistic movements where the whole point is, what do you substitute that with your notion of where does meaning and goodness come from? It comes from humans, right? Okay, so self-selection, heterogeneity, all of that. Nonetheless, you sit down a whole bunch of religious people, self-described and atheists, and you ask them, how often are you charitable? How often do you help someone? Things of that sort. And religious people come off way more looking a whole lot better. Okay, so that's hunky-dory, and it looks like we've just proven that. But then you got to start unpacking that. First off, what have you just found? That if you ask people, how often do you give to charity? You get answers like that. How about if you actually observe them? And it turns out people who are religious, on the average, are much more attuned to social approval and being monitored and things of that sort. They exaggerate, they tend to overestimate. How often do you give blood each year? And then go look at the actual records, and religious people tend to overestimate. So we gotta don't ask people how pro-social they are, go and get actual field data. So that's the first thing. Next thing is you got this demographic problem, which is on the average, religious people in this country are more likely to be female, older, more involved in a community, and a higher socioeconomic status. Whereas atheists are more likely to be male, young, not particularly socially connected. So suddenly you got, is the difference in the prosociality because of gender, because of age, so that's a mess to control for. So next you see that religious people are prosocial only if you remind them, consciously or otherwise, that they're religious. Ask someone to say, are you religious or not? And if you ask them a question like that, they're going to be more generous in an economic game afterward. But the cool stuff is when you do it subliminally. Sit down subjects, they're religious. They describe themselves as religious. And these people, their task is write out as many of the 10 commandments as you can. Write out up to 10 books you read in high school, and then you put them in, and the ones who've been primed to think about the 10 commandments are more cooperative or more pro-social. Or ask someone to unscramble a word, L-E-H-L. How do you unscramble that into a word? Hell or heaven and versus unscrambling secular terms. They're going to be more pro-social afterward. Send somebody walking down a street where they walk past a church or not. And if they're a religious person, that will prime them to be more cooperative afterward. Play music in the background. And if it's religious, so yeah, what we've just found out is religious people are more pro-social if you remind them of their religiosity. But there's a problem with that, which is those same primes make atheists more pro-social also, of just being reminded of that. I mean, even if you're an atheist, it probably seems reasonable not to covet your neighbor's livestock or whatever's going on in the 10 commandments there. It works in them also as much. And in addition, atheists are primed by secular terms of prosociality, like civic duty, things like that. Okay, so how are you pulling it out? Next, what counts as being more moral? And this gets into the whole realm of different moral anchors on the average for religious people versus atheists. A way of asking that, philosophy, are you a deontologist or are you a consequentialist? Do you not do something because it's simply wrong and you don't do that? Deontology, or consequentialist, because in this case, the consequences are going to be, in that case, maybe we can think about it again, situational, context dependent, deontology. Religious people tend to be deontologists when it comes to things like violations of purity and loyalty and sacred values. In contrast, atheists tend to be deontologists when it comes to moral issues of harm avoidance and fairness. So it's what's counting as what there. So that's part of it. Okay, next, when you show people that, you control for all that stuff and atheists are not all that rotten compared to religious people, one of the standard responses are, of course, look, the study's being carried out in the United States where 5% of people say they're atheist. They're nicer because they've got all this religious stuff oozing over and osmotically. And what happens if you put them all together and they don't have the good religious examples all around them? What you get is a far more workable society. You take a whole infestation of atheists, like in Scandinavian countries, and every measure of prosociality is higher than in the United States. So it's not just, all that goodness of religious people all around you rub off on the rare American atheist. Next, what counts as a charitable act? And religious people think much more in terms of an individual act. Atheists think much more in terms of a collective act. So depending on how you define it, you are being charitable when you give somebody some money, a very individualistic act. Framed a different way, you are being charitable when you vote for a candidate who's going to raise your taxes to take better care of the poor. Which counts as which? Okay, so we've got all these modifiers. The final modifier is the most interesting one, which is looking at, you look somebody in need, and are religious people more pro-social or atheist, and who's the person who's in need? And this is where you get the really critical thing. On the average, pro-social charitability, generosity, and so on among the highly religious tend to be in group. for people like me, for people who look like me, pray like me, eat stuff like me, whatever. It tends to be in groups. Something like 70% of the charitable contributions in this country are people giving to their religious organization, their local house of worship, their local religious community. And this is very local. This is very parochial, to use a term relevant to that. Whereas you look at atheists and their prosociality is much more likely to be for an outgroup than you see for a religious person. Who is it who counts as an us, who counts as a them? So overall, you look at it closely, and there is not a leg to stand on the notion that there is an implicit moral rot to deciding whether or not, to act ethically based on whether or not you're going to be held responsible for that ultimately or not. When you dissect it, prosociality is basically equal in religious people who have thought a lot about it and atheists who have thought long and hard about it as well. Because the thing they have in common is they've thought long and hard about where meaning comes from and goodness and all of that. Okay, so that's my atheistic rant.
So finally, Nathan from Canada asks, why did you dedicate your book Behave to John Newton? How has he inspired you?
John Newton has inspired me enormously. This 1917 book of mine, 2017. That's an interesting slip. This 2017 book of mine, Behave, was, among other things, dedicated to this guy, John Newton, who inspired me. John Newton, 18th century British theologian. That doesn't sound very exciting. Okay, he played a major role in the British Empire banning the slave trade in 1807. Okay, that's a little bit hopeful. As a theologian, he wrote hymns, and one of the ones he wrote was Amazing Grace. So that's even cooler. Amazing Grace, with or without Joan Baez, and like Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, are like two songs that always do. Okay, so British theologian who wrote Amazing Grace and helped ban the slave trade in the British Isles, and okay, so we're obviously seeing some like holy roller story here of this guy. But it gets interesting because for most of his life, John Newton worked as the captain of a slave ship. Whoa, you see just where we're heading here. At some point, he sees the light and humanity of those he has enslaved, and nah, it never happens. He's like, at one point, before he's the captain, he's just a regular schmo there, and he's like whipped by the captain of the ship for something he did, and you would say, aha, he's going to suddenly feel empathy, my pains and their pains, and I'm going to come out against slavery. Nah, not a thing. He's on another ship, and he's apparently such a jerk that the other sailors dump him in Sierra Leone, where he's made a slave there by a slaver, and it takes months for him to be rescued, and he gets back on a ship, and does he have this revelation that slavery is long because I myself have felt what is that? No, not at all. He goes back to being a slaver. He becomes the captain of a ship. He gets caught in some incredible storm, and he prays to God that if you spare me, I will devote my life to you or whatever, and the storm stops. And does he oppose slavery at this point? Nope, doesn't with that at all. So finally, he stops being a slaver. Oh, he's seen the light transformation. No, he's getting too old and aches and pains for sailing like that. He retires and goes to theology school and invests in the slave trade. In the parlance of my native village of Brooklyn, back before it became trendy, can you believe this fucking guy? He goes, he's a theologian now, and he's getting rich from the slave trade. 34 years after he stopped being a slaver, something changed in him, some amazing, graceful thing changed in him, and he finally came out against slavery and had this enormous moral authority because, whoa, this guy hasn't been sitting here working with the lepers since he was 3 years old. From the moment he was a theologian, he was great to the poor of London and was renowned for that while still investing in slavery. It just took a long time for a shift. as to who is an us, who is a them, to look past normal biblical conventions that say the slavery is fine. Okay, why do I think he's so cool? Obviously, this is an amazing story, but he's so cool because he's so easy to identify with. And you get some of these people who turn out to be just morally heroic, and they do it in this flash of lightning. Like the 3 guys who stopped the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War just acted with like Olympian moral strength with 5 seconds to think about it. As do people who jump in rivers to save or hide refugees without a moment's hesitancy, all of that. Like, they're amazing. Like, they don't put their pants on one leg at a time, and that's really hard to aspire to be like them. Newton, though, he makes up excuses. He gets a little more humane for people like him while still ignoring them. He expands as he gets maybe the conventional religious version of being ethical, can't push himself to post-conventional thinking about it. He's tired. It's somebody else's problem. Somebody else will take care of it. It's their own damn fault. I can't cure everything, all of that. And you see him, he takes like 10 steps forward and he takes 9 self-justifying steps backward, and like he's filled with all the foibles and the excuses the rest of us are, and he manages nonetheless to eventually crawl his way to being this moral giant. So he's hugely inspirational to me. He is the best, even if like you don't like the song.
And on that note, that concludes episode 23. Keep submitting your questions at the forum found in the Instagram story highlight in bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.